This presentation is called Critiquing the Ontological Justification for Property, and I'm primarily going to be using Daniel Loic's book, The Abuse of Property, to talk about Hegel's ontological justification for property and how we might critique it. So, inspired by the 1970s German squatters movement and its slogan, "Better squat than rot," Daniel Loic's book, The Abuse of Property, challenges the philosophical assumption that property is a condition of use, and instead explores property as an obstacle to use. The first half of the book unpacks two different bourgeois forms of argumentation, termed the liberal justification for property and the ontological justification for property. Locke would be example of the former, and Hegel the latter. The second half of the book offers a Marx-based social critique of property and then an ethical critique of property following the Franciscan form of life. I am primarily going to be focusing on Loic's critique of the ontological justification of property since we're more focused on Hegel, and then I'll expand a little bit on his argument with some citations from Marx, but I will situate the argument within the larger context of the book. According to Daniel Loic, the mainstream philosophical discourse on property revolves around the question of how exactly to ground the connection between use and ownership. The larger trajectory of this book is to see if he can philosophically argue that property, rather than leading towards use, leads towards abuse. Here we have some posters from the German squatters movement. Those are sprinkled throughout. So Locke is Loic's paradigmatic example of the liberal justification for property, and I won't go super deep into Locke's argument because he's not really our focus, but I'm going to cover just enough so that we can see the difference. So the liberal justification for property does so on the basis of individual rights. Freedom assumes the primacy of individual rights, and then state rights are derivative. Locke suggests that private property can be derived from the nature of human beings as creatures of need. The idea essentially is that in order to legitimately use a thing, you also need the power to exclude all others from use via ownership. Locke says that God gave the earth to humankind in common, but instructed us to divide it up and cultivate the earth. There are caveats to Locke's form of property. For example, unlimited accumulation is not supposed to be allowed, and the owner is not supposed to just be able to do anything with property. It is said that only goods necessary for life, or goods which can be used in common, must be privatized. Labor is also introduced as a means of acquiring property, but this presupposes that legitimate work on an object is possible in the first place, and it also leaves unclear the degree of labor necessary to obtain a property title. And it's worth mentioning that in his two treatises, Locke equates his own labor with the labor of his servant. He also understands labor as an isolated activity. To critique a liberal justification of property, one might look to contest the state of nature and contextualize individuality within a social historical process, or look at the use of such a theory within colonial frameworks. Loic points out McPherson's Marxist analysis of possessive individualism as an ideological complement to bourgeois capitalist society. Loic also takes a peek into Locke's colonial ties. For example, he invested in the Royal Africa Company and the Company of Merchant Adventures to trade in the Bahamas, and he co-authored the Carolina Constitution, so he had a huge role in shaping English colonialism. Loic writes, Locke simply equates the prohibition of waste with a command to cultivate. This then enables him to classify American land as so-called wasteland. And for Locke, if an area is not cultivated in a European sense by the native population, it can be appropriated by another population as private property. Locke also suggests that leaving land fallow generates a duty to punish those who defy the divine command to cultivate. So Locke's justification of property also ends up being a very convenient justification for colonization. Tully also critiques Locke in relation to the domination of nature, but this is sort of where we'll leave it for the liberal justification. The key points are that ownership and use are equated, and individualism is naturalized. The ontological justification of property, for which Hegel is really the pioneer, argues the indispensability of a relation to the self and world characterized by property. For Hegel, property is essential to the construction of the subject, and the philosophy of right in the section on abstract right, paragraph 41, on property, Hegel writes in the addition, "The rational aspect of property is to be found not in the satisfaction of needs, but in the superseding of mere subjectivity of personality. Not until he has property does the person exist as reason." In 47, Hegel writes, "As a person, I am myself an immediate individual. In its further determination, this means in the first place that I am alive in this organic body, which is my undivided external existence. Universal in content, the real potentiality of all further determined existence. But as a person, I at the same time possess my life and body like other things." So, in order to achieve a rational construction, the subject must take possession of oneself and objects in the world. Hegel has really no need to fabricate a state of nature because he recognizes historical necessity, so he sees his starting place as the result of a social and historical development. He therefore proceeds constructively rather than reconstructively. For Hegel, the development of free subjectivity is only possible within a property order. If for Locke property enables the subject to use things, for Hegel property is the external grounding of subjectivity which enables a subject who can will things in the world. For Hegel, the simple satisfaction of needs is not enough to constitute a free subject. And this process of taking possession is continuous throughout an individual's life. For Loic, the role of private property for Hegel can be examined in 3 ways. 1, subjectively, 2, intersubjectively, and 3, through civil society as an ethical system. In order to critique a liberal justification of property, we primarily need to look at the state of nature, historicize it, look at the assumption of the individual. For Hegel's ontological justification of property, we would actually need to critique the specific form of subjectivity created by the form of property he is dealing with, and look at how that bodes for intersubjectivity and eventually civil society. Loic mentions that Macpherson and Tully only critique the objective impossibility of use, but not the subjective side. He says a critique of Hegel's theory of property must respond on this level. It must show that the subjectivity produced by property is not a successful, but instead a deficient subjectivity, for which there are better alternatives. Shortly thereafter, he also says that destroying through owning no longer only means that the object is damaged, but that the subject is damaged as well. And this reminds me of a part of the Grundrisse where Marx discusses a similar issue in relation to private property. In Notebook 5, Marx says, "Not only do the objective conditions change, but the producers change too, in that they bring out new qualities in themselves, develop themselves in production, transform themselves, develop new powers and ideas, new modes of intercourse, new needs, and new language." So what he's getting at here is an inherent shift in the subjectivity of human beings after private property comes on the scene. He also says that in bourgeois, this is on page 496, just one after the one I just read, in bourgeois society, the worker stands there purely without objectivity subjectively, but the thing which stands opposite him has now become the true community, which he tries to make a meal of, which makes a meal of him. This connects the idea that the kind of subjectivity produced by private property is an impoverished one, which also damages the intersubjectivity of human beings at large and inhibits their ability to relate to their species being. So Marx, of course, has a very robust critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, entitled The Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, but I wanted to bring out some other places where I think Marx's theory is really useful for critiquing the ontological justification for private property, specific areas where he draws out the manner of subjectivity that capitalism produces. In the 1844 manuscripts, Marx talks a lot about how within the private property structure, being is degraded into having, and all physical and mental senses are relatedly degraded and estranged through this mediation of having. He offers that communism would be the positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement, and therefore as the real appropriation of the human essence by and for man. And this would be the complete return of man from religion, family, the state, etc., to his human, i.e., social existence. Marx also does a lot of work to show how the dot-like isolation of the individual is produced, constructed by a historical process, and a very violent one at that. I already read a couple of quotes from the Grundrisse. Notebook 5 is primarily where he talks about the creation of an isolated individual as a subjectivity deprived of its objective component. Capital Volume 1 really spells out the mechanisms by which private property is a process of exploitation. Loic summarizes capitalist property as unjust, dysfunctional, and alienating. At the level of intersubjectivity, private ownership of the means of production is presupposed. There is an inherent instrumentalism in relation to the other that comes out of an atomistic subject who can only relate to others as things. And this is interesting because Hegel sees the liberal market as a way of reconciling the particular with the universal. So the idea is that in a capitalist economy, by pursuing one's own individual needs, you are ultimately being socialized to the needs of others. Loic would argue via Marx that bourgeois private property orders force people to be mutually indifferent to the needs of others, since they are relating to their self and to the world only via objects. People are thus not recognized as need-oriented human beings, but as means to other ends. Loic also points out that capitalist society, following Marx, necessarily produces unfree subjects along with free subjects. Hegel registers but cannot explain the fact that accumulation of wealth in one class is accompanied by a dependence and want from the other class, which limits their ability to enjoy the wider freedoms of civil society. Hegel takes note of this but doesn't really seem to take an issue with it. He does, however, take issue with the idea of the rabble, which for him is unavoidable and also the systematic antipode of a free legal person. And Marx points out that due to the crises inherent in the capitalist structure, there is a necessary dependence on a partially unemployed or fully unemployed reserve labor army that can then be used when these boom and bust cycles occur. This rabble population that Hegel can't really figure out how to deal with, Marx can locate in the structure of capitalism itself, showing that there is an inherent irrationality to the civil society. Loic also points out the inefficiency of capitalist markets that run civil society via the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. For Loic, the squatter is a model of a new subject who is no longer legal but is inherently political. The social critique of private property developed out of Marx only deals with a specific form of property, but Loic goes on to elaborate a broader critique of property as such, inspired by Proudhon's What is Property, in which property renders use and abuse essentially indistinguishable. So a pretty radical claim. So he has to go beyond Marx here to try and do that, towards first an ethical critique of property and then a political critique. So the ethical critique is primarily developed out of the Franciscan form of life and the ideal of poverty. The basic idea that Loic brings out is that an appropriating attitude towards the world leads to an emptied, dominating, and insubstantial subjectivity and intersubjectivity that is ultimately incompatible with use. The Franciscans are able to abdicate right and live outside of the legal order, but they do this through a minor status, making them dependent on a paternalistic structure that involves private property. This is in some ways related to why Loic thinks that this ethical critique is not enough and that we need to move beyond it towards a political critique. He says that the friars lacked sufficient imaginary concepts and images to go beyond the merely oppositional status that their form of life ultimately assumed, and for this reason they were doomed to be unpolitical. To move beyond a merely social or ethical critique of private property and turn towards a political horizon, Loic primarily employs the example of the squatters movement in the 70s in Germany, and he is really interested in how squatters put to use abandoned private property. Vacant buildings are a great example of how private property can impede use, and squatters are returning these empty properties to use, often repairing them. Some other examples I can think of that might challenge private property in an instantiated and political way are the Black Panther Party survival programs, which obviously were a huge threat to the existing formal economy, so much so that they were met with incredible violence. I'm also thinking about libraries of things in terms of intellectual property. I thought about open source structures. We also have repair movements and mutual aid economies. I'm sure there are more.